The first lie Russell Holloway told that morning was that the money had nothing to do with why he was there. He sat across the probate courtroom in a charcoal suit that still carried its tailor's crease, one hand resting over my late husband's name on the petition to remove me as co-trustee. "This is about protecting Jonathan's daughter," he said. "Mrs. Holloway has no blood relationship to Eliza, and for 9 years she controlled who the child could see, what she was told, and which requests reached the trust company. No blood relationship. 9 years of fevers, parent conferences, braces, nightmares, college applications, and empty chairs at school concerts disappeared beneath 4 words. Beside me, Eliza sat so still that the silver ring on her thumb had stopped turning. She had turned 18 3 months earlier, which meant nobody in that room could legally decide where she lived, but they could still ask the court to erase my name from the trust her father had built for her. Russell's attorney smiled, as if the case had already been decided. Marjorie lowered her eyes and pressed a tissue to dry cheeks. Then Denise Parker stood. "Your Honor, before the court rules on the petition, there is one conditional statement from Jonathan Holloway that bears directly on his choice of co-trustee." Judge Carver studied the sealed drive, then ordered the clerk to play it. The screen flickered. Jonathan appeared thinner than I remembered him, wrapped in the blue robe he wore during his last winter. For one terrible second, the courtroom vanished. I was back beside his bed, counting the space between his breaths. Russell leaned toward his mother. Both of them were still smiling. Jonathan looked directly into the camera. "Kate," he said, "before anyone accuses you of staying for the money, I need you to forgive me." The smiles across the aisle disappeared. "I never told you what those shares might become." Eliza's hand found mine under the table. Jonathan drew a shallow breath. "And if my mother and my brother are in that room, ask them to explain why they refused my daughter before they knew she was worth anything. 9 years earlier, on the first night after his funeral, Eliza had climbed into my bed and asked whether I was going to leave her too. This was the story of why I said no. Before I take you back to where it began, tell me where you are listening from and how your day is going. Stay with me, because every choice that followed began with one frightened child at a bedroom door, and please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss what happened next. During Jonathan's final week, our house seemed to shrink around the room where he was dying. Hospice had placed his bed beside the window, though he rarely opened his eyes long enough to see outside. A glass of water sat near his right hand. He would reach for it, stop halfway, and look at me with an apology he no longer had the strength to say. I learned to lift the straw before he asked. His old film camera rested on the dresser, with 23 pictures still left on the roll. Jonathan had always refused to waste a frame. He waited until Eliza forgot he was watching before pressing the shutter. Now she sat in the hallway with a math worksheet balanced on her knees. She pressed her pencil so lightly that I could barely hear it. At 9 years old, she had already learned to make herself smaller whenever the adults around her were hurting. "You can work at the kitchen table," I told her. She glanced toward her father's room. "I'm okay here." I almost called her sweetheart. I almost said, "Come sit with Mom." Instead, I told her there were apple slices in the refrigerator. I had been in her life since she was 4. I had braided her hair badly, packed forgotten lunches, and sat beside her through sickness and school plays. Still, I never used the word mother for myself. Her mother had died before I met her, and claiming the title felt like stealing from a dead woman. That afternoon, while Eliza showered, Jonathan opened his eyes and asked me to close the bedroom door. "Denise has the papers," he whispered. I adjusted his blanket. "What papers?" "The ones that make sure Eliza stays with you." The words landed harder than I expected. We had talked around the future for months without naming his absence. "Your mother should be involved," I said. "Russell, too. She needs people who knew you before I did." Jonathan looked toward the closed door. For several breaths, he said nothing. Denise sent them a formal question, he finally said. "And?" His fingers moved against the sheet, as if searching for mine. She is handling it. That is not an answer. It is the answer I have right now. I wanted names, promises, signatures, something solid enough to stand on after he was gone. Then I saw how much the conversation was costing him. "Kate," he said, "do not let anyone make her think she has to earn a place in this house." I held his hand until his breathing settled. I told myself there would be time to ask Denise later. There was not. Jonathan died 2 mornings after that. The sun had barely reached the floorboards. I was standing beside his bed, warming a washcloth in my hands, when I realized the mattress had stopped rising beneath him. The refrigerator kept humming. Eliza remained in the hallway, waiting for the next breath, because no one had told her there would not be one. I knelt in front of her. I do not remember the words I used. I remember her asking whether he was cold, and thinking there should have been a sound large enough to mark the moment our family changed. The house stayed painfully ordinary. At the funeral, Marjorie wore black gloves despite the September heat. She accepted condolences with a straight back, as though hosting a formal luncheon instead of burying her son. Russell stood near Denise after the service. I heard him ask, "When do we review Jonathan's papers?" Denise's expression did not change. "Not today." I found Marjorie near the church steps, while Eliza sat inside with one of Jonathan's co-workers. My arms were full of folders and sympathy cards. "I need a few days to handle the house and the paperwork," I said. "Could Eliza stay with you until the weekend?" Marjorie's face tightened before I finished. "She was Jonathan's daughter," she said. "She was never yours. But that does not make her our responsibility now." For a moment I thought I had misunderstood. She just lost her father. And I lost my son. Russell came up beside us. He heard enough to know what I had asked, but he did not offer his home, his time, or even a ride. "Eliza needs to stay somewhere familiar," he said. "Moving her around would only make things worse." He said it as if he were protecting her. Then he walked his mother to their car and left me on the church steps. Denise approached after they drove away. She gave me a sealed envelope. "You do not need to open this now," she said. Written across the front in Jonathan's handwriting were the words, "For Eliza, when she is old enough to choose." I placed it in the back of a desk drawer. That night, I slept for less than an hour before the floor creaked outside my room. Eliza stood in the doorway wearing Jonathan's gray sweater. The sleeves covered her hands, and the hem nearly reached her knees. "Can I come in?" she asked. I lifted the blanket. She lay stiffly on the far side of the bed, leaving a strip of cold mattress between us. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then she asked, "Are you going to leave me too?" I could have promised everything would be fine, but children know when adults use impossible promises to hide fear. "I don't know how to do this without your dad," I said. "But I know I'm not leaving." Eliza turned toward me. Her fingers closed around the sleeve of my nightshirt, not my hand, as though she still needed a way to let go quickly. She fell asleep holding on. I stared at the ceiling until morning, listening to the soft drag of her breathing and understanding what daylight would bring. People would ask whether I had the right to keep Jonathan's daughter. Lying beside her, I knew only that I could not be another person who chose to leave. By the time the sun came up, Eliza had loosened her grip on my sleeve, but had not let go completely. I stayed beside her until the alarm clock began to glow against the wall, afraid that moving too soon would make my promise feel temporary. 3 days later, I sat across from Denise Parker in her Sacramento office with Jonathan's death certificate in my bag and a knot beneath my ribs that had not eased since the funeral. Denise arranged 2 folders on the desk. "These are separate matters," she said. "The guardianship decides who is responsible for Eliza's care. The trust decides how Jonathan's assets are held and used for her benefit." I looked from one folder to the other. "Which one decides whether she stays with me?" "The guardianship decides that." Jonathan had named me as the person he wanted to raise Eliza. Her mother had died years before I entered their lives, but his nomination did not make the decision automatic. A probate judge would still have to decide what served Eliza best. Denise opened the second folder. Valley State Trust Company will hold the money, make the investments, keep the accounts, and approve distributions. Jonathan named you as co-trustee because you know Eliza's daily needs. You will not be paid, and you cannot transfer money to yourself. What money are we talking about? There is life insurance, an education account, and some private company shares that are difficult to value. We do not need to solve that today. I almost laughed at the absurdity of the word money. I had spent the morning deciding whether I could afford to replace the broken water heater without touching the emergency account. What happens if Jonathan's family objects to me? Then they will have to appear and tell the court what they want. That frightened me more than I admitted. Marjorie had already said Eliza was not her responsibility, but people sometimes rejected a burden privately and claimed a right publicly. I had no shared blood, no adoption order, and no name on Eliza's birth certificate. All I had was the life we had lived together. Denise suggested that I ask Marjorie to support the guardianship, even if she did not want to care for Eliza herself. A simple statement that Eliza should remain in the home she knew could prevent weeks of uncertainty. I made the call from my kitchen that evening while Eliza colored at the table. Marjorie answered after the fourth ring. "The court needs to know whether you object to Eliza staying with me," I said. "You would not be taking on any responsibility. I am only asking you to confirm that she should remain in her home. I will not sign myself into an arrangement Jonathan created without consulting me. He was dying, Marjorie. And I was losing my son." I lowered my voice. "Eliza is losing everyone at once. That is not my doing." Russell came onto the line a moment later. I heard Marjorie tell him I was trying to involve them legally. "I cannot take on personal or financial responsibility for a child," he said. "My business is unstable enough already. No one is asking you to raise her. Then leave me out of it." Denise had warned me not to argue. If they would not help, she needed their refusal in writing, so the guardianship would not be delayed by unanswered questions. "I understand," I said. "I won't ask again." When I turned, Eliza was standing near the doorway. I did not know how much she had heard. She looked at the phone in my hand, then returned to the table without asking anything. After that, she became easier in a way that scared me. She made her bed before breakfast. She carried her dishes to the sink and wiped the counter without being asked. When her winter boots split along the side, she pushed a piece of cardboard inside and said they still worked. At the grocery store, she stopped reaching for the cereal Jonathan used to buy. One evening, I found her placing $2 from her school lunch money into the jar beside the refrigerator. "What is that for?" I asked. "The electric bill." "You do not pay the electric bill." "I thought I could help." I crouched beside her. "You are allowed to need things, Eliza." She stared at the jar and said she knew, but her face told me she did not believe it yet. The bills made it harder to prove my words. Jonathan's medical costs were settled, but the mortgage remained. The house had been chosen for 2 incomes, and a future we no longer had. Every room carried him, but memory did not reduce a monthly payment. Denise explained which expenses the trust could legitimately cover for Eliza. School costs, health needs, clothing, and other things clearly meant for her could be submitted to Valley State. My share of the household remained mine. I could have tried to keep the house and asked the trust to carry more of Eliza's portion. Instead, I called a real estate agent. Selling felt like another death. Jonathan had painted the kitchen cabinets himself. Eliza's height marks still climbed the pantry wall. His coffee cup sat in the same cupboard because neither of us could decide whether moving it would be disrespectful. Still, keeping a house I could not afford would have turned every grocery bill and every school expense into a question about Eliza's money. I wanted a line between what belonged to her and what I owed as the adult who had promised to stay. The guardianship hearing came before the house sold. Marjorie and Russell did not appear. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. There was no jury and no dramatic argument, only a judge in a dark robe, Denise beside me, and Eliza sitting with her hands tucked beneath her thighs. The judge reviewed Jonathan's nomination, the home study, my employment records, and the fact that Eliza's mother was deceased. Then she looked over her glasses at Eliza. "You understand that Kate has asked to become your legal guardian?" Eliza nodded. "And where do you want to live?" Her eyes moved toward me, then back to the judge. "I want to go home with Kate." She did not call me Mom. I did not need her to. The judge granted me guardianship of her person. Denise quietly reminded me that this meant I was responsible for Eliza's care, school, medical decisions, and daily life. It did not make me the sole controller of Jonathan's trust. Valley State still held the assets and supervised every distribution. The distinction mattered to the court. To me, the only thing that mattered was that Eliza reached for my hand when we stood to leave. Outside the courtroom, Denise gave me a thin packet. "These are Jonathan's requests to his mother and brother, along with their responses." I looked at the heading on the first page but could not make myself read further. The words blurred before they became sentences. "I cannot read this today," I said, slipping the packet into my folder. 2 months later, the sale closed. Our new house was smaller, with a narrow hallway and a lemon tree that leaned over the back fence. Eliza's room faced the afternoon sun. Before the movers brought in her bed, she stood in the empty room holding Jonathan's film camera. The shutter clicked. "Why did you take a picture of an empty room?" I asked. She lowered the camera. "So, I can remember we were here before somebody changes it." I wanted to tell her nobody could change it. I had learned enough by then to avoid promises I could not control. Instead, I carried the last box inside and hung the new keys on a hook beside the front door. Eliza watched me. "Are we going to have to move again?" I touched the key until it stopped swinging. "Not because somebody decides we do not belong here." For the next 9 years, our life did not change in one dramatic moment. It changed in rooms, one ordinary decision at a time. The first was an emergency room when Eliza was 11. She woke before dawn, with pain low on her right side, and insisted she could still go to school. By noon, she was curled against the passenger door, while I drove through Sacramento traffic with one hand on the wheel and the other reaching toward her whenever the car stopped. The doctor said, appendicitis. Surgery would be simple if they moved quickly. Nothing about it felt simple to me. I signed the consent forms as her legal guardian, answered questions about allergies, and called Valley State when the hospital asked for insurance information connected to Jonathan's trust. The process took minutes, but every signature reminded me that someone had once needed to decide whether I was allowed to keep this child. After surgery, Eliza drifted in and out beneath a heated blanket. Her cheeks were flushed, and her hair clung damply to her forehead. I leaned close when she moved her lips. "Mom," she whispered, "don't go." The word reached me before I was prepared for it. "I'm here," I told her. "Go back to sleep." When she woke properly the next morning, she remembered asking for water and nothing else. I did not tell her what she had called me. I did not ask her to say it again. I carried the word home quietly and kept it where I kept all the things I was afraid to claim. Marjorie called that same night. For one hopeful second, I thought someone at the hospital had contacted her. Then she asked whether I had found Jonathan's watch collection. "My granddaughter is recovering from surgery," I said. "I heard Russell mentioned something online. She is 11. You could ask how she is. I assume you would tell me if it were serious." I looked through the glass at Eliza, sleeping beneath the hospital lights. Marjorie continued. "Those watches belonged to Jonathan's father before him. You should remember that certain things belong with his real family." I ended the call without answering. Eliza never knew Marjorie had called. At the time, silence felt kinder than letting her discover that her grandmother had remembered a drawer of watches before remembering her. 3 years later, the room that held us together was our kitchen. I had begun taking evening shifts twice a week to help with rising expenses. One Thursday, I came home after 9 and found a plate covered with foil on the stove. Eliza had left a note beside it, Heat for 2 minutes. I already did my homework. She was 14 then, all long limbs and careful questions. The next morning, she placed a school form beside my coffee. Her history class was planning a 4-day trip to Washington, D.C. The cost was printed at the bottom. "This looks wonderful," I said. "It is not important. You brought me the form, so you would know why everyone else is talking about it." I asked when the deposit was due. She folded the paper in half and slipped it beneath her cereal bowl. I changed my mind. Her face had the same expression she wore when her boots split years earlier. She had learned new words, but she was still trying to make herself inexpensive enough to keep. "You want to go?" I said. "We do not need to spend that much. You are not a household expense to be reduced." She looked away. "I know. I paid the deposit from my savings. To cover the rest, I sold the gold bracelet Jonathan had given me on our 5th anniversary. It had spent more time in a drawer than on my wrist, and selling it did not make me noble. It made me sad for an afternoon, and relieved when the final payment cleared. I did not tell Eliza. I wanted her to remember the museums, not calculate what I had surrendered to send her there. The week before her trip, a birthday card arrived from Russell, almost a month late. He had signed only his name. Beneath it, in smaller writing, he had added a question. "Do you know what happened to Jonathan's North Star shares?" I stood in the kitchen holding the card while Eliza packed snacks for the flight. I could have given it to her and explained the sentence. I could have let her decide whether a late card with a financial question still counted as contact. Instead, I placed it in the back of the desk drawer with the guardianship papers. I told myself I was protecting her from being used. What I was actually doing was choosing which parts of her family she was allowed to see. By 17, Eliza had turned the narrow laundry room behind our garage into a dark room. The lemon tree brushed the roof above it, and the chemical smell followed her into the house, no matter how carefully she sealed the bottles. One Saturday, she developed several rolls Jonathan had left behind. I stood beside her beneath the red light while images slowly surfaced in the trays. One showed Jonathan holding a garden hose. Another captured Eliza asleep against his shoulder. A third caught me laughing, with my face turned away from the camera. Then, another picture appeared. Marjorie sat on our old porch with a much younger Eliza in her lap. Her arms were wrapped around the child, and both of them were smiling. Eliza lifted the wet photograph by its edges. "She looks like she loved me." I watched the liquid run from one corner. She probably did. Then why did they never call? There were answers I could have given. They called a few times. They asked the wrong questions. One of those calls ended with you crying. I blocked the numbers because I thought removing them was safer than teaching you how to survive them. "Instead," I said, "they chose not to be part of our lives." It was true, but not complete. Eliza looked at me and accepted it without suspicion. That trust should have comforted me. Instead, it left a small pressure beneath my ribs. The photograph dried on a line above us. A few months later, an envelope from Valley State Trust Company arrived with a red mark across the top, requesting my immediate attention. Inside was a notice that North Star Medical Systems had entered a purchase agreement. Jonathan's private shares, once difficult to value and impossible to sell, were now worth approximately $2.4 million inside Eliza's trust. I read the number 3 times. Jonathan had told me those shares might never become anything. He had spoken of them the way people speak of an old lottery ticket left in a drawer. I called Naomi Grant at Valley State. She confirmed the company still held and invested all trust assets. I remained an unpaid co-trustee, which meant I could help assess Eliza's needs and consider unusual distributions, but I could not move money into my own account or approve payments by myself. "Eliza is the beneficiary," Naomi said. "The trust can support education, medical care, and reasonable housing. Most of the principal remains protected until she turns 25, according to Jonathan's instructions." I thanked her and sat at the kitchen table with the letter between my hands. Before calling Denise, before answering another question, I told Eliza. She read the notice in silence. I expected disbelief, maybe excitement about college or the kind of future that no longer required her to count every expense. Instead, she looked up. Did Dad know? I thought of Jonathan telling me the shares might never be worth anything. I thought of the sealed envelope in my desk, and all the truths adults believed they were entitled to delay. I don't know, I said. That evening, the doorbell rang. Marjorie stood on the front step beside Russell. Between them was a cardboard box filled with old photographs of Jonathan. Marjorie looked past me at Eliza. We heard what happened to your father's company, she said. We thought it was time you knew your family. For several seconds, I stood in the doorway, without inviting them inside. Marjorie held the cardboard box against her chest. A faded blue scarf rested on top, the one Jonathan used to wrap twice around his neck whenever the Sacramento mornings dropped below 50 degrees. Russell stood a step behind her with both hands visible, as though he wanted me to notice he had brought no papers. Eliza came into the hallway. Is that Dad's? She asked, looking at the scarf. Marjorie's expression softened. He wore it through almost every winter in college. I wanted to close the door. I also remembered the photograph drying beneath the red light, and Eliza asking why her grandmother had never called. 1 hour, I said. We do not discuss the trust. Russell nodded immediately. We came to see Eliza. He said it with the confidence of a man who expected the sentence itself to count as proof. We sat in the living room. Marjorie placed the box on the coffee table and removed each item carefully. There were school photographs, old birthday cards, a baseball glove with Jonathan's name written inside, and a picture of him at 12, with both knees scraped raw. Eliza picked it up. What happened? He tried to jump his bicycle over a drainage ditch, Marjorie said. He made Russell go first, watched him fall, and then decided he could do it better. Russell smiled. He landed farther into the ditch. Eliza laughed before she could stop herself. The sound changed the room. For a moment, Marjorie was not the woman who had refused to take her after the funeral. She was a mother remembering a reckless boy. Her hands trembled slightly as she passed Eliza another photograph. He was afraid of water, she said. Eliza looked surprised. Dad taught me to swim. That was why he learned. He was 27 before he could cross a pool without grabbing the side. When you were born, he said no daughter of his would ever see him afraid of something that could save her life. I had never heard that story. Eliza looked at me as if checking whether I already knew. I shook my head. Marjorie smiled at her, and I saw something real in it. She had loved Jonathan. She may even have loved Eliza. In the limited way she allowed herself to love anyone whose needs complicated her own. Russell apologized before the hour ended, though he never named what he had done. We handled things badly after Jonathan died, he said. Everyone was grieving. Time passed, and then it became harder to know how to come back. You could have started with a phone call, I said. His gaze moved briefly toward Marjorie. We were told that would not be welcome. I felt Eliza watching me, but Russell shifted the conversation before she could ask what he meant. He looked around our living room, taking in the repaired lamp, the worn sofa, and the stack of college brochures beside Eliza's camera bag. Have you chosen a school? He asked her. I'm deciding between two. Both in California? She nodded. If you attend somewhere near the coast, housing will be expensive. A small condo might make more sense than paying rent for 4 years. That could be a reasonable trust expense. My attention sharpened. Valley State had discussed education, medical care, and reasonable housing with Eliza and me. None of those details had been made public. We agreed not to talk about the trust, I said. I was talking about college planning. You were talking about a distribution. Russell raised both hands. I work with property. I think in practical terms. The hour ended soon after that. Marjorie left the scarf with Eliza and promised to find more photographs. At the door, she touched Eliza's cheek with 2 fingers, then seemed to think better of embracing her. After they drove away, Eliza carried the box to the kitchen table. "Can I see them again?" she asked. Every instinct I had developed over 9 years told me to say no. They had returned within days of learning about North Star. Russell knew enough about the trust to test its boundaries during his first visit. Then I remembered the birthday card in my desk and the answer I had given in the dark room. They chose not to be part of our lives. I had already made too many choices on Eliza's behalf, without telling her they were choices. "Yes," I said, "but some were public." She studied my face. "You don't trust them." "I trust what people do more than what they say." "That isn't an answer." "It is the most honest one I have." We met them for lunch the following Saturday, at a restaurant near the river. I chose a table in the center of the dining room, far from private corners. Marjorie arrived with another envelope of photographs. Russell arrived with a leather folder he never opened. At first, the conversation stayed with Jonathan. Marjorie told Eliza how he once skipped an important exam because Russell had broken his wrist and refused to go to the hospital alone. Russell laughed and said Jonathan had complained about the missed exam for years. Then the food arrived, and the questions changed. Russell asked how much financial aid Eliza expected to receive. He asked whether I had encouraged her to apply out of state. He asked whether Valley State had explained how the trust would treat housing. "I thought this lunch was about Dad," Eliza said. "It is," Russell replied. "His planning is part of what he left you." Marjorie placed her hand beside Eliza's plate. "You have lived carefully for a very long time. Jonathan would not have wanted you counting every dollar, while nearly $2.5 million sits untouched." My fork stopped against the plate. "How much did you say?" I asked. Russell answered before his mother could. "She is speaking generally. She said nearly $2.5 million. The acquisition was public. Anyone could estimate the value of early employee shares. Not without knowing how many shares Jonathan owned." Russell took a sip of water. "Then perhaps I read a figure somewhere." Eliza looked from him to Marjorie. The warmth she had shown in our living room faded. Russell leaned forward. "Kate has done what she could, but she is not a financial professional. There is no insult in admitting that. A licensed fiduciary could make independent decisions without family emotion getting in the way." "Whose family emotion?" Eliza asked. "Everyone's." Marjorie smiled, as though trying to repair the conversation. "You deserve to live like a Holloway." Eliza's shoulders tightened. "I already live like one. It is my name." "You know what I mean." "I don't think I do." The lunch ended without dessert. That evening, Russell sent Eliza a link to a furnished apartment near one of the colleges she was considering. His message said the trust could probably purchase it instead of wasting money on rent. Marjorie began sending photographs every morning. Jonathan on his first day of school. Jonathan holding Russell as a baby. Jonathan beside a lake, squinting into the sun. Eliza looked at each one, but she stopped replying after the third day. They were trying to compress 9 empty years into a week of memories. Marjorie called me privately on Friday. "You have had 9 years," she said. "You do not get to keep all of him. Eliza is not what remains of Jonathan for us to divide. You know exactly what I mean. I know you returned after learning the value of the shares." Her voice cooled. "And I know you have spent years deciding what Eliza was allowed to know about us. I kept her away from people who had already rejected her." "Did she ask you to do that?" I did not answer quickly enough. Marjorie noticed. "You call it protection," she said. "Other people may call it isolation." She ended the call before I could respond. A few minutes later, Eliza entered the kitchen holding her phone. The color had left her face. Russell had sent her a screenshot of an old call history. Marjorie's number appeared more than once. Below it, he had written a single message. "Before you decide who abandoned whom, ask Kate what she never told you." Eliza stood across the kitchen island, with Russell's screenshot glowing in her hand. Did they call? There was no safe version of the answer left. Yes. The word changed her face more than any excuse could have. How many times? A few times, during the first 2 years. You told me they chose not to be part of our lives. They did. That is not what I asked. I reached for the back of a chair, but did not sit. They called, Eliza. I should have told you that. She placed the phone on the counter between us. What did they want? The truth had once seemed too ugly to give a grieving child. Now every year I had kept it from her made it heavier. Your grandmother asked about your father's watches, his papers, and things she believed should stay with the Holloway family. Russell wanted to know what happened to the North Star shares. Sometimes they asked how you were, but the conversation always turned back to property or money. Eliza's eyes did not leave mine. Did they ever ask to see me? Marjorie asked to speak with you once. What happened? I remembered the call clearly. Eliza had been 10, sitting on the floor with a puzzle spread around her knees. She had taken the phone eagerly, because I told her it was her grandmother. Marjorie said your father would have wanted you to remember who your real family was, I said. Then she told you I was not your mother, and never would be. Eliza's hand closed around the edge of the counter. You cried until you fell asleep. The next morning you asked whether the judge could change his mind and send you away. I don't remember that. I do. So you blocked them? Yes. And when I asked why they never called, you lied. I told you the part I thought would hurt you least. That is still a lie. I wanted to say I had done it because I loved her, but the sentence sounded too much like a request to be forgiven. I was wrong to decide what you could handle. Eliza turned away and pressed both palms against the counter. What else did you decide I could not handle? The sealed envelope was still in my desk. Russell's birthday card was behind it. The packet Denise had handed me after the guardianship hearing had remained unread for years. I don't know, I admitted. She looked back at me. That is not an answer either. It is the honest one. She took her camera bag from the chair. Where are you going? To the dark room. Let me drive you. No. Eliza, it is almost dark. I am not 9 anymore. The front door closed before I could answer. Every part of me wanted to follow her. I wanted to explain the hospital call, the birthday card, and every moment I had believed silence was protection. Instead, I stood in the kitchen and let her leave without turning her anger into another thing I controlled. She texted 15 minutes later to say she was safe. She did not say when she would return. Russell called while I was still staring at the message. You should let her hear both sides, he said. You sent a teenager fragments of old records without context. I sent her facts. You sent her a weapon, only because you gave me one. I lowered my voice. What do you want? An independent professional should oversee the trust. Someone who is not emotionally entangled with Eliza. Valley State already oversees it. You still have influence over special distributions. You spent years controlling her access to family. A court may wonder what else you controlled. You told Denise you could not accept personal or financial responsibility for Eliza. That was 9 years ago, before the shares were worth anything. He paused. Then he said, You should speak to your lawyer. The papers arrived 2 days later. Marjorie and Russell had filed a petition in Sacramento County Probate Court. Denise explained it to me at my kitchen table, because I could not bear to sit in another office while someone discussed whether I belonged in Eliza's life. They are not asking for custody, she said. Eliza will be 18 in August, and your guardianship will end then. They are asking the court to suspend you as co-trustee, review the past distributions, and appoint a professional fiduciary. Russell said he wanted independence. The fiduciary they proposed has worked with his company before. I looked at the petition again. The words undue influence and conflict of interest appeared more than once. They are saying I manipulated her. They are saying your roles as guardian, caregiver, and co-trustee gave you too much influence. I never moved $1. Valley State's records will show that. Denise tapped another section. They are also requesting an accounting and reserving the right to seek a surcharge. What does that mean? If they persuade the court that you approved improper expenses or violated your fiduciary duty, they could ask for a judgment against you personally. My eyes moved toward the window above the sink. Beyond it, the lemon tree leaned against the fence of the first home I had bought without Jonathan. Could they take the house? They do not have a claim to your house. But if you lost and faced a large judgment and legal fees, you might have to sell assets to pay it. The distinction was legally important and emotionally useless. Russell had no right to my home. He only needed to make defending it too expensive. He had also asked for emergency relief, claiming Eliza's college tuition and housing deadlines required immediate protection. Denise said the court would not decide the whole dispute in a few weeks. It could preserve the trust, keep ordinary tuition and medical payments moving through Valley State, and temporarily restrict unusually large distributions while setting a faster evidentiary hearing. They want urgency because urgency scares people into surrendering, she said. What happens until the hearing? Valley State continues paying approved essentials. Russell does not gain control. You remain co-trustee, unless the judge orders otherwise. I read a paragraph accusing me of isolating Eliza from her paternal family to preserve emotional and financial influence. The money had never been mine. I knew that. Denise knew it. Valley State's records would prove it. Still, seeing 9 years reduced to an allegation made my hands shake. Every packed lunch, every fever, every parent meeting, every night Eliza had stood at my bedroom door could now be described as a calculated investment in someone else's inheritance. After Denise left, I opened the desk drawer. The guardianship papers were beneath Russell's old birthday card. Behind them was the sealed envelope Jonathan had left. I lifted it for the first time in years. Written below Eliza's name was a line I had never noticed. To be opened only if her right to choose, or Kate's role under the trust, is challenged. The front door opened. Eliza entered with her camera bag over one shoulder. Her eyes were swollen, but her voice was steady. I heard they filed something. They did. Are they trying to make me live with them? No. They cannot decide where you live, and your guardianship ends when you turn 18. They are trying to remove me from the trust. She looked at the papers on the table. Because you blocked them? They are using that. They are also saying I influenced you for financial reasons. Did you? No. Her gaze dropped to the envelope in my hand. What is that? Something your father left with Denise. Have you opened it? No. Eliza nodded, but she did not move closer. I don't know who I believe about everything that happened, she said. The sentence hurt, but I had earned part of it. You do not have to decide tonight. I am not going to Grandma's. I was not going to ask you to leave. I know. She walked down the hallway and entered her room. This time, when the door closed, I understood it was not only fear on the other side. It was doubt, and I had helped put it there. The words on Jonathan's envelope followed me into Denise Parker's office the next morning. I placed it on her desk without opening it, and she turned it over carefully, checking the seal and the handwriting before looking at me. It contains a digital recording Jonathan left with written instructions, she said. He did not authorize us to use it, simply because the family became difficult. The condition was specific. It could be presented if Eliza's right to choose, or your role under the trust, was formally challenged. Then the condition has been met. Yes, but that does not mean I can hand it to you and let you walk into court with it. We have to establish when it was made, how it was stored, and why it relates to Jonathan's intent. The judge will decide whether it can be shown. I stared at the envelope. Do you know what he said? I do. And you are not going to tell me. Not yet. If you hear it now, every decision you make afterward may become a reaction to a dead man's instructions. Jonathan left evidence, Kate. He did not leave you permission to stop thinking for yourself. The answer irritated me because it sounded like something Jonathan might have asked her to say. Before I could argue, Denise slid another document across the desk. Russell's attorney had proposed a settlement. At first, the terms looked almost merciful. Russell and Marjorie would withdraw the request to hold me personally responsible for 9 years of trust expenses. They would stop seeking repayment from me, and each side would cover its own legal fees up to the day the agreement was signed. They would also promise not to circulate their accusations among Eliza's school, my employer, or the people in our community. In return, I would resign as co-trustee. A licensed professional fiduciary selected by Russell's side would take my place. I would agree not to oppose future housing and education distributions approved by that fiduciary, and Eliza would not have to testify about our family in open court. I read the pages twice. Russell cannot take my house. No, Denise said. He has no claim to it. But if we keep fighting and the court orders a surcharge against me, or if the legal fees become too large, I may have to sell it anyway. That is possible. And this makes that threat disappear. It makes one threat disappear by asking you to surrender the position Jonathan gave you. I looked again at the promise that Eliza would not have to testify. That line had more power over me than anything involving money. I imagined her sitting in a courtroom, while lawyers pulled apart every frightened decision I had made since Jonathan died. I imagined Marjorie crying, Russell speaking gently, and Eliza being asked to choose which version of her childhood was true. Would resigning hurt her? I asked. That depends on who replaces you, and how that person uses the discretion in the trust. They are proposing a professional. They are proposing someone they selected. That is not the same thing as neutral. Denise did not tell me more. She only said the background of the proposed fiduciary was still being reviewed. The settlement meeting happened 2 days later, in a conference room that smelled of coffee and printer toner. Eliza was not present. Russell said that was proof he wanted to protect her. Marjorie sat across from me with her hands folded over a leather purse. This does not have to become a public war, she said. A real mother would understand when stepping back protects the child. I felt Denise shift beside me, but I answered before she could. I stepped forward because no one else would. And now you cannot bear to step away, Marjorie replied. Perhaps this has stopped being about Eliza. Russell leaned toward the table. Nobody is questioning the years you cared for her. We are questioning whether the person who raised her should also influence how millions of dollars are used. Valley State controls the money. You still have a voice. So does Eliza. She is 17 and emotionally dependent on you. That is exactly why an independent fiduciary makes sense. Every sentence was designed to make surrender sound responsible. If I signed, Eliza would not have to testify. My job would not be dragged into the case. The house would not be placed at risk by a judgment I could never afford. Russell would lose the power to describe me publicly as a woman who had raised a child for money. All I had to give up was the voice Jonathan had entrusted to me. By the time I returned home, I had almost convinced myself that resigning would be my final act of protection. I printed the agreement at the small desk in my bedroom, then left the pages beside the printer while I went to make tea. Eliza was standing there when I came back. She held the first page in both hands. Her eyes moved over the paragraph naming Russell's proposed fiduciary. You were going to sign this? I was considering it. Without telling me. I wanted to understand it first. You already understood enough to print it. I took a breath. If I sign, you do not have to testify. They withdraw the claim that I owe the trust money. They stop threatening to send the accusations to my employer. And you leave the trust. I resign from one legal position. I do not leave you. Her expression hardened. Why do you always call it protection when you decide something before I know it exists? I am trying to keep you from being forced to speak against your father's family. They brought the case, not me. I know. Then why am I the one losing the person Dad chose? I reached for the pages, but she held them against her chest. Eliza, this is a trust. It is not guardianship. It is not custody. You are almost 18, and no one can make you live anywhere. You promised you would not leave, she said. Signing away the only voice Dad gave you is still leaving. That voice could cost us this house. The truth escaped before I could soften it. Eliza looked around the room, at the narrow closet door and the worn edge of the carpet. So, that is what this is about. No. It is about the possibility that I lose the case, owe money I do not have, and lose my job because Russell keeps repeating the same accusation until someone believes it. It is about watching lawyers turn every mistake I made into proof that 9 years with you were a financial plan. My throat tightened, but I made myself continue. I am afraid a judge will look at the blocked calls, the card I hid, and every time I told you only part of the truth, then decide none of the rest matters. I am afraid they will put a dollar value on everything I did and call it influence. Eliza's anger did not disappear. It changed. Then stop asking the court to tell you what you were to me. The room became very quiet. I had spent years believing that if I carried enough alone, Eliza would never have to feel the weight. Instead, I had taught myself to hide every difficult choice until it became a secret she had to discover. I took out my phone and called Denise while Eliza was still standing beside me. When Denise answered, I said, "Reject the settlement." "Are you certain?" "Yes. Give them the complete records. The calls I blocked, the card I kept, every distribution I approved, and every request I opposed. I do not want a cleaned-up version." I looked at Eliza. "And I will not ask her to take my side." Denise was silent for a moment. "Then we prepare for the hearing." Russell's response arrived that evening. His attorney said they would pursue the surcharge, seek recovery of legal fees, and ask the court to freeze every special distribution until the case was resolved. I forwarded the letter to Naomi Grant. She called within the hour and assured me that the court's preservation order still allowed Valley State to pay Eliza's approved tuition, medical needs, and ordinary living expenses. Russell could make the threat sound larger, but he could not stop everything simply by writing it in a letter. I returned to the bedroom with the unsigned agreement. Eliza stood in the hallway outside her room. I placed the pages back in their envelope without signing them and pushed it to the far end of the desk. Eliza did not hug me or say she forgave me. She opened her bedroom door and looked back. "I'm still angry," she said, "but I'm here." The court's first order arrived in July. It allowed Valley State to continue paying Eliza's tuition deposits, medical expenses, and ordinary living costs, but it temporarily froze unusually large distributions until the November hearing. Russell did not gain control, and I remained co-trustee, yet every request now carried the feeling that someone outside our home was measuring whether I deserved to sign my name. Eliza turned 18 in August. There was no dramatic courthouse moment when my guardianship ended. At midnight, the law simply stopped treating her as a child whose residence I could decide. The next morning, she opened a letter from Valley State addressed directly to her and read a trust report that would once have come through me. I baked the same lemon cake Jonathan used to make for her birthdays. We ate it at the kitchen table, still careful around each other, but the caution had changed. Eliza no longer needed my permission to leave, remain in the house, speak to Marjorie, or refuse her calls. When she chose to stay, I could no longer pretend the choice belonged to anyone but her. In September, she began college within driving distance of Sacramento. Valley State paid the tuition directly and approved her ordinary housing expenses without delay. The case continued in the background, through documents, deadlines, and conversations Denise compressed into short updates. I did not need to hear about every filing. I only needed to know what each development might ask Eliza or me to surrender. Our only full preparation meeting took place in late October. Denise spread a long sheet of paper across her conference table, while Naomi Grant opened the trust records on a laptop. Eliza sat beside me rather than between us, a small change I noticed without mentioning. Denise drew 5 marks on the paper. "This is the case without the speeches," she said. At the first mark, Jonathan had asked Marjorie and Russell to serve as backup guardians if I could not care for Eliza. At the second, both had refused. At the third, the court had appointed me guardian, and Jonathan's trust had placed me beside Valley State as an unpaid co-trustee. At the fourth, 9 years of records showed that I had received no compensation while the company controlled every dollar. At the fifth, North Star was sold. The trust became worth approximately $2.4 million, and Jonathan's family returned. Denise capped her pen. The November hearing is not about whether Kate made every personal decision perfectly. The judge will decide whether there is enough evidence of breach, unfitness, or undue influence to remove her from the trust. She opened the first folder. Inside were the letters and emails from 2017 that I had been too exhausted to read after the guardianship hearing. Denise did not read them aloud. She summarized the parts that mattered and told us the complete wording would be reserved for court. Russell had written that he could not assume personal or financial responsibility for a child. Marjorie had said Eliza should remain with the woman who had chosen that life. Neither response had asked what Eliza needed, how frightened she was, or whether I could manage alone. Eliza kept her eyes on the pages. They knew Dad was dying when they wrote this? Yes, Denise said. And Kate asked them to help? Both Kate and Jonathan did. Eliza did not look at me. Her silence was not forgiveness, but it removed one lie Russell had tried to place between us. Naomi opened the second set of records. The report showed every payment Valley State had made for Eliza's benefit. Hospital bills, school expenses, approved travel, therapy after Jonathan's death, and later college costs. All had receipts and corporate approval. Beside the summary of trustee compensation was a zero. No fee was ever paid to Kate, Naomi said. No trust money entered her personal accounts. She could recommend or oppose certain distributions, but Valley State reviewed and issued every payment. She showed 2 requests I had declined. One involved a larger portion of the mortgage after we moved. The other would have allowed the trust to pay more of a family trip because Eliza was included. Both might have been defensible, Naomi said. Kate refused because she believed the trust would also be paying expenses that belonged to her. I remembered those decisions only as nights at the kitchen table with a calculator and a headache. On paper, they looked cleaner than they had felt. The third folder belonged to Russell. Denise had obtained emails between him, a financial advisor, and the professional fiduciary he wanted appointed. Attached was a spreadsheet titled Eliza Transition. It listed a condo, renovation work, management expenses, and vendor fees. Several companies were linked to Russell, or people with whom he regularly did business. One email contained the sentence that made Eliza sit back in her chair. Once Kate is removed, the family can guide the distributions. Russell had not asked how Eliza wanted to live. He had planned the contracts first. Will that win the case? I asked. No single document wins it, Denise said. It shows motive. Valley State's records show no financial breach. The old letters show who refused responsibility. Together, they make Russell's story harder to believe. Then she turned toward me. They do not erase the calls you blocked. I know. He will argue that you mixed your role as mother with your fiduciary duties. He will say you controlled her relationships, then used that dependence to remain in the trust. I never threatened her with money. That is not the only form of influence. You need to be honest that the line between protecting Eliza and deciding for her was not always clear. The meeting ended with more truth than comfort. Denise and Naomi left us alone while they made copies in the next room. I looked at Eliza. There is something I need to say without asking you to make me feel better afterward. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. I should have told you the truth when you were old enough to ask. I was afraid of what it would do, so I took the choice away from you. I did not add that I loved her. Love was true, but in that moment it would have sounded like a defense. Eliza looked toward the glass wall of Denise's office. I understand why you did it. That does not make it right. No. Do you think you can forgive me? Not all at once. The answer hurt less than a quick forgiveness would have. It meant she was no longer protecting me from the consequences of my own choices. When Denise returned, Eliza told her she wanted to speak at the hearing. You are not required to defend Kate, Denise said. I'm not going to defend anyone's version, Eliza replied. I'll say what I remember. Who was there, who wasn't, what Kate kept from me, and what they wanted when they came back. Denise nodded. That is exactly what the court needs. By then, Eliza was no longer a minor whose words could be filtered through a guardian. She would speak as the adult beneficiary of the trust, and for the first time, no one in the room would be legally entitled to translate her life for her. A week before the hearing, Marjorie posted a long message online. She never mentioned the trust's value. She wrote that she was a grieving mother whose granddaughter had been taken from her, that Jonathan's legacy was being controlled by a woman outside the family, and that she had been denied the chance to repair old mistakes. People from Jonathan's church, former neighbors, and strangers who knew none of us began sending messages. Some asked polite questions. Others called me a gold digger and said a real grandmother should never have to fight for access to her own blood. I did not answer. Any public defense would have required me to expose Eliza's childhood so that strangers could choose a side. I had already spent too many years deciding which truths belonged to her. I would not give them away now, to protect my reputation. The night before the hearing, Denise placed Jonathan's sealed drive inside her trial bag. I watched her close the zipper. "What did he say?" I asked. She rested her hand on the bag. "Enough to hurt you. Not enough to win this without the truth you already lived." The next morning, Eliza came into the kitchen wearing a dark dress and Jonathan's film camera around her neck. The leather strap was cracked with age, and the weight of it rested against her chest. "Do you want to leave that here?" I asked. She placed one hand over the camera. "No. Everybody keeps telling me who he was. I want something that remembers him without talking." The camera rested against Eliza's chest as we entered the probate division of the Sacramento courthouse. Nearly 5 months had passed since Russell and Marjorie filed their petition, but the room still felt arranged around the first accusation. They were asking the court to remove me from Jonathan's trust, not to decide where Eliza lived. She had turned 18 in August, and nobody in that courtroom could claim custody of her. Even so, I felt the old fear from the guardianship hearing return when I saw our names printed on opposite sides of the docket. Russell sat beside his attorney, wearing a dark suit and Jonathan's watch. I recognized the square silver face and the scratch near the crown where Jonathan had struck it against our garage door. Marjorie had once insisted the watch belonged with his real family. Seeing it on Russell's wrist made the years between the funeral and that morning seem less like absence and more like patience. He had waited until something valuable brought him back. Marjorie wore navy instead of black and kept a tissue folded between her fingers. She looked smaller than she had at the funeral, almost fragile, until her eyes met mine. Then her shoulders straightened, and I saw the same certainty that had allowed her to leave Eliza on the church steps without believing she had abandoned anyone. Eliza sat beside Denise and me as an adult beneficiary of the trust. Her thumb moved over the old camera strap, then stopped when Russell's attorney rose. He began with the phrase I had expected and still was not prepared to hear. "Mrs. Holloway has no blood relationship to Eliza." He described my 9 years with her as a concentration of power. I had been her caregiver, her legal guardian, and one of the trustees responsible for considering her personal needs. According to him, those roles had allowed me to control her relationships and shape her understanding of Jonathan's family. He said I had blocked calls, hidden correspondence, discouraged contact, and then used the emotional dependence I created to justify remaining in the trust. He never accused me of stealing money directly. Valley State's records made that impossible. Instead, he argued that money did not have to enter my bank account for me to benefit from influence. By remaining beside Eliza, I had kept a voice in decisions involving millions of dollars. The story was cruel, because parts of it were true. When I took the witness chair, Russell's attorney did not ask about the nights Eliza slept in my room after Jonathan died. He did not ask who attended her parent conferences or sat beside her hospital bed. He asked questions that required one-word answers. "Did you block Marjorie Holloway's number?" "Yes." "Did you keep birthday cards from Eliza?" "1 card." "So the answer is yes?" "Yes." "Did you tell Eliza that her paternal family chose not to contact her?" "Yes." Did you advise Valley State against making certain distributions for household expenses? Yes. Each answer removed context and placed another clean stone on Russell's side of the scale. When Denise questioned me, I explained that Marjorie's calls had focused on Jonathan's possessions and that one conversation had left Eliza afraid the court would take her away. I explained that Russell's card included a question about North Star shares, and that I had rejected trust payments when they would also cover expenses that belonged to me. I did not call those choices perfect. I said I had believed I was protecting Eliza, and had later understood that I was also deciding which truths she could bear. Across the room, Marjorie lowered her eyes. For a few minutes, she looked like the woman who had been denied access, rather than the woman who had refused responsibility. I could feel people in the courtroom shifting toward her version. When Marjorie testified, her voice trembled in the right places. She said grief had made her cold after Jonathan's death. She admitted she had said things she regretted but claimed I had never allowed her enough time to repair them. She spoke about losing her son and watching another woman become the center of his daughter's life. I called, she said. I sent cards. I tried to maintain some connection, but Mrs. Holloway decided I was dangerous. Judge Carver listened without changing expression. When Marjorie finished, the judge folded her hands. What high school did Eliza attend? Marjorie glanced toward Russell. I believe it was in Sacramento. What was the name? I do not recall. Who was her pediatrician? I was not given that information. What subject did she plan to study in college? Marjorie's tissue tightened between her fingers. Photography, perhaps. Eliza wanted to study environmental design. Photography was the one thing Marjorie had noticed because the camera made Jonathan visible. Judge Carver continued. Eliza underwent emergency surgery at 11. What procedure was performed? Marjorie said she had heard about an illness but had been kept away. What date did Eliza turn 18? The silence lasted long enough for Marjorie's grief to lose some of its shape. Russell presented himself differently. He was calm, practical, and careful, never to say he wanted control. He claimed his only goal was to place discretion in the hands of a professional fiduciary who had no emotional dependence on Eliza. When Denise asked about the spreadsheet titled Eliza Transition, he described it as a preliminary cost analysis. The condo, renovation work, and management fees were examples, not plans. He denied expecting his company or associates to profit. You knew the trust was worth approximately $2.4 million when you contacted Eliza, Denise said. No, you mentioned nearly that exact amount during your second meeting with her. I had read about North Star's acquisition. The number of shares Jonathan held was not public. Russell adjusted the cuff above Jonathan's watch. Then, I was estimating. Denise allowed the answer to remain where he had placed it. She had not yet shown the court the full email chain, and I understood that pressing too hard would only warn him where the real damage waited. Naomi Grant testified next. Her explanation was brief enough for anyone in the room to understand. Valley State held and invested the trust assets. I had never received trustee compensation. I could not transfer trust money into my own account, and every distribution required review by the corporate trustee. No audit had found self-dealing, missing funds, or an improper payment to me. Russell's attorney responded that clean accounts did not resolve emotional influence. Naomi agreed that bank records could not determine why Eliza trusted one person more than another. That answer left the most painful accusation alive. Judge Carver looked down at the petition. She said the court was not there to decide who deserved to call themselves family. The legal question was whether there was sufficient cause to remove me for breach of trust, unfitness, harmful hostility, undue influence, or another reason that threatened the proper administration of Jonathan's trust. The court must also consider the settler's intent and the present interests of the adult beneficiary, she said. Neither blood nor affection replaces evidence. Denise stood and placed the sealed drive on the evidence table. She explained when Jonathan had recorded the statement, how her office had received it, and the written conditions requiring it to remain sealed, unless my role under the trust or Eliza's right to choose was challenged. Russell's attorney objected. He called the recording hearsay, emotionally prejudicial, and an attempt to allow a deceased man to decide a present dispute without cross-examination. Denise did not argue that the video proved every allegation false. She said it was relevant to Jonathan's reasons for choosing the trustees, the safeguards he created, and the circumstances surrounding the family's original refusal. Judge Carver reviewed the written instructions, then allowed the video for that limited purpose. The clerk connected the drive to the courtroom monitor. The screen flickered, and Jonathan appeared in the blue robe he had worn during his final winter. His face was thinner than memory had permitted me to keep, and for a moment I forgot the petition, the trust, and the people watching us. Russell leaned toward Marjorie. They were still smiling. Jonathan looked directly into the camera and drew a shallow breath. "Kate, before anyone accuses you of staying for the money, I need you to forgive me." The dark screen beside him reflected Russell's face as his smile disappeared. Jonathan looked into the camera, as if he could see me sitting in that courtroom 9 years later. "I never told you what those shares might become," he said. "I did not know they would ever be worth millions. I only knew North Star had a chance to become something larger, and that the stock might someday give Eliza choices I could not give her myself." His voice was thin, but every word was deliberate. I remembered the afternoon he had dismissed the shares as something that might never be worth anything. At the time, I had believed he was protecting me from one more financial uncertainty. Now I understood that he had protected himself from a question he was afraid other people might ask about me. "I kept that from you because I wanted no one to say you stayed for money," he continued. "I thought if you did not know what might be there, nobody could question why you cared for Eliza. That was unfair to you. I made a choice about what truth you were allowed to carry, and I am sorry." Eliza's hand tightened around mine beneath the table. The apology did not comfort me. It hurt because it reached the same place my own mistake had come from. Jonathan had loved me, yet he had still decided that withholding the truth was a form of protection. I had done the same thing to Eliza. On the screen, he paused to catch his breath. "Valley State will hold the assets, keep the accounts, and approve every distribution. Kate cannot take that money for herself. I named her as co-trustee, without compensation, because she knows when Eliza is afraid, when she is pretending not to need something, and when an expense will help her rather than impress someone else. The company will control the money. Kate will help them understand the child." Russell shifted in his chair. The movement drew my attention to Jonathan's watch on his wrist. "I did not build the trust so one person could control everything," Jonathan said. "I built it so the people who understand money and the person who understands Eliza would have to answer to each other." Naomi lowered her eyes toward the report in front of her. The structure Russell had described as dangerous had been the safeguard Jonathan intended. Then Jonathan spoke about his family. "Kate asked me to keep my mother and brother in Eliza's life. She asked for a backup guardian because she was afraid grief might leave our daughter with only one person. Denise contacted them at my request. They were told that accepting did not mean taking Eliza immediately. It meant promising that if Kate could not care for her, somebody from my family would step forward." Marjorie's tissue remained pressed between her fingers, but she no longer held it near her face. "My brother wrote that he could not accept personal or financial responsibility for a child. My mother said Eliza should remain with the woman who had chosen that life. I will not pretend those words did not hurt. I will also not pretend Kate pushed them away. At the moment when she was preparing to lose her husband, she was the one asking them not to abandon my daughter." Jonathan leaned back against the pillows. For several seconds, the only sound in the courtroom came from the recording of his breathing. "If my mother and my brother are in that room," he said, "ask them why they refused my daughter before they knew she was worth anything." Marjorie closed her eyes. Russell stared at the table as though the grain of the wood might offer an answer. Jonathan's final words were quieter. "No trust document can tell Eliza where home is. When she is old enough to answer, listen to her. The money is for her education, her health, her safety, and the life she chooses to build. It is not a reward for anyone who believes being related gives them a claim over her. He looked into the camera one last time. Kate, I am sorry I left you another truth to carry. Eliza, I am sorry I will not be there when you choose what to do with it. The image went dark. No one spoke until Judge Carver asked Denise to proceed. Denise placed the 2017 letters before Russell. He confirmed his signature after studying it longer than necessary. The sentence Jonathan had repeated appeared in the middle of the page. Russell had written that he could not assume personal or financial responsibility for a child. You understood Jonathan was asking you to serve only if Kate became unable to care for Eliza? Denise asked. Yes. You were not being asked to take her immediately? No. And you still refused? My circumstances were different then. Denise turned to Marjorie's response. Marjorie admitted the signature was hers. Her letter said, Eliza should remain with the woman who had chosen that life, and that she did not want a legal obligation placed upon her during her grief. Judge Carver looked at her. When did your grief begin to permit responsibility? Marjorie's lips parted, but no answer came. The judge continued. Was it before or after North Star Medical Systems announced its sale? I had regretted my decision for years. But you took no legal action, requested no regular contact, and offered no support during those years. Kate had blocked me. Judge Carver glanced at the call records. The block occurred after the conversation in which you told a 10-year-old that her guardian was not her real mother. What did you do after that to demonstrate that renewed contact would be safe for Eliza? Marjorie looked down at her hands. Denise called Naomi back to clarify the trust reports. Naomi confirmed that I had received no trustee fees, that no trust money had entered my personal accounts, and that Valley State had reviewed every distribution. Did Mrs. Holloway know the shares would be worth approximately $2.4 million before your April notice? Denise asked. No, Naomi said. The final valuation depended on the acquisition price and the trust's verified share count. She learned the amount when we notified her and Eliza. Could she have sold those private shares earlier? For her own benefit? No. Could she approve a payment to herself without Valley State? No. Denise then placed Russell's email chain on the screen. The first message had been sent to the professional fiduciary weeks before Russell appeared at our door with Jonathan's photographs. Attached was the spreadsheet titled Eliza Transition. It included a condo, renovation contracts, property management, and vendor fees connected to Russell's company or his business partners. Denise highlighted a single sentence. Once Kate is removed, the family can guide the distributions. Russell leaned toward his attorney. This time, no explanation arrived quickly enough. You testified that the fiduciary was independent, Denise said. Why were you discussing family control with him before Eliza had agreed to any housing plan? It was preliminary planning. For whose benefit? Eliza's. Did Eliza ask you to select a condo? No. Did she ask your company to renovate one? No. Did she ask you to calculate management fees? Russell's jaw tightened. No. When Denise finished, Judge Carver asked whether I wished to make a brief statement. I stood without bringing notes. I blocked calls and kept information from Eliza, I said. I believed I was protecting her, but I took away choices that should eventually have belonged to her. I was wrong. Marjorie looked up, perhaps expecting the admission to rescue her case. I am not asking this court to call me her mother, I continued. I am asking it not to replace Jonathan's safeguards with people who came back carrying a calculator. I sat down before fear could make me say more. Eliza rose next. The camera remained against her chest, and she rested one hand over it while she faced Judge Carver. Kate should have told me about the calls and the cards, she said. I am still angry that she decided what I was allowed to know, but a few calls do not erase 9 years. They do not turn people who stayed away into people who raised me. She looked toward Marjorie and Russell. I am not a trust, a legacy, or proof of who loved my father most. I'm not choosing who controls the money. I'm choosing whether the person who stayed should be erased because the people who left finally learned the number. Then Eliza turned toward me. She stayed before either of us knew what the shares were worth. Judge Carver reviewed her notes in silence. When she looked up, her attention settled on Russell. Blood may explain why you are standing here, she said. It does not explain where you were. Then she opened the tentative ruling she had amended after hearing the evidence. Judge Carver read the ruling without raising her voice. She denied the petition to suspend or remove me as co-trustee. The records showed no breach of trust, no self-dealing, and no evidence that I was unfit to continue the limited role Jonathan had assigned me. Valley State would remain the corporate co-trustee, responsible for holding the assets, investing them, maintaining the accounts, and issuing every payment. I would continue serving without compensation, helping evaluate Eliza's personal needs until the trust terms changed, or she reached 25. The judge made one distinction unmistakably clear. Eliza was 18. My guardianship had already ended, so no one in that courtroom had authority to decide where she lived, whom she visited, or which relatives she allowed into her life. She would receive the trust reports directly, participate in decisions affecting her, and retain the right to return to court herself if she ever believed either trustee should be replaced. Russell's proposed fiduciary would not be appointed. Judge Carver found that the petition had been pursued in bad faith and against Jonathan's clearly documented intent. Russell and Marjorie would be responsible for most of my reasonable legal expenses. None of their fees, planning costs, or failed requests could be paid from Eliza's trust. The request to surcharge me personally was denied. I did not feel triumphant when the judge finished. I felt as if I had been holding my breath since the morning Jonathan stopped breathing, and my body had forgotten how to release it. Russell whispered something to his attorney. The man shook his head and pointed to a paragraph in the ruling. Russell's face tightened when he understood that the trust would not pay for the case he had brought against it. Marjorie remained seated while everyone else gathered their papers. Her folded tissue had torn down the middle. Outside the courtroom, Russell walked past us without speaking. Jonathan's watch flashed beneath his cuff as he pushed through the doors. He had spent months describing himself as the only person practical enough to protect Eliza's inheritance. In the end, the documents he created to profit from, it had done more damage to him than anything Denise or I could have planned. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They unfolded during the following months through letters, canceled meetings, and calls Russell stopped returning. One of his lenders obtained records from the case and discovered that Russell had described possible access to family-managed trust resources while attempting to restructure his business debt. The lender withdrew the offer. A commercial client later canceled a renovation contract after the emails and spreadsheet became part of the court record. By spring, Russell's company entered bankruptcy. I did not celebrate. I did not call him or send him copies of the ruling. His downfall did not come from revenge. It came from the same habit that had brought him to our door. He had treated other people's futures as assets he could quietly place on a spreadsheet. Marjorie's punishment was quieter. She followed us into the courthouse hallway after Russell left. Eliza was placing the lens cap back on Jonathan's camera when Marjorie approached. "I am still your grandmother," she said. Eliza looked at her for a long moment. There was no anger in her face, which made the answer harder. "You were related to me the whole time," she said. "You only wanted the title when it came with access." Marjorie's mouth tightened. "I made mistakes. So did Kate." The comparison seemed to give Marjorie hope, until Eliza continued. "Kate admitted hers without asking me to pretend they never happened. You are still talking as if being my grandmother is something you can declare. I loved your father. I know. I love you." Eliza rested one hand over the camera. "I don't want contact right now. If that changes, I will decide when." Marjorie looked toward me, perhaps expecting me to soften the answer or encourage reconciliation. For years, I might have done exactly that. I would have mistaken politeness for healing and pushed Eliza toward a relationship because I was afraid resentment would make her bitter. This time, I remained silent. The choice belonged to her. The first meeting after the ruling took place at Valley State. Naomi placed a college budget in front of Eliza instead of sliding it through me. We discussed tuition, reasonable housing, emergency reserves, and the importance of leaving most of the principal untouched. Eliza did not ask for a condo or a new car. She wanted her current tuition covered and enough housing support to avoid taking on unnecessary debt. She also asked whether part of her annual allowance could pay for an advanced photography course. Naomi looked at me out of habit, then corrected herself and turned back to Eliza. "That is your request," she said. "Tell us why it matters." Eliza explained that photography was not her degree, but it helped her understand memory, place, and design. She spoke without apologizing for the cost, or trying to prove that she deserved it. Jonathan had built the trust to give her choices. For the first time, I watched her make one, without asking whether it would make her harder to keep. At home, I emptied the back drawer of my desk. I placed every birthday card, photograph, and letter I had kept in a box. Russell's old card lay near the top, with his question about the North Star shares written beneath his signature. Eliza sat across from me at the kitchen table, while I pushed the box toward her. "These belong to you," I said. "You can keep them, throw them away, or contact anyone connected to them. I will not make that decision again." She read each card slowly. She kept the photographs of Jonathan and placed Marjorie's letters in a separate envelope. When she reached Russell's card, she tore away the handwritten question about the shares and dropped that piece into the trash. She kept the part with Jonathan's brother's signature. "I want to remember that people can do one decent thing for the wrong reason," she said. Later that week, I met with Denise to update my will and personal documents. I named Eliza clearly, not through vague language or assumptions. I wrote down what I wanted her to receive, what choices belonged to her, and who should speak if I could not. I had spent too much of our life believing love should be obvious from what I did. Jonathan's silence and mine had taught me that people should not have to search through sealed envelopes to learn whether they were chosen. On the first night after the case was finally behind us, I woke to footsteps in the hallway. For an instant, I was 39 again, lying in the bed where Jonathan should have been, waiting for a frightened 9-year-old to ask whether I would disappear too. Eliza stood at my bedroom door. She was 18 now, taller than I was, with the silver ring turning beneath her thumb. "You should have told me the truth," she said. "I should have. I'm still angry." "You're allowed to be." She looked into the room, and I moved slightly beneath the blanket before realizing she was not asking to come inside. "But you stayed," she said. She turned toward her own room, then paused with one hand on the doorframe. "Good night, Mom." Her door closed a few seconds later. I listened to the quiet hallway and understood that the sound no longer meant she was shutting me out. Eliza could close her door because she finally trusted that she would not have to open it in the morning to see whether I was gone. Jonathan taught me that parenthood could begin with a promise. Eliza taught me that love became real only when the truth was allowed to stay in the room with us.